I know we're 3 minutes in, and it always takes everybody us a couple minutes to get started, and everybody to get a couple minutes to come off of their last meeting of the day. But it is my pleasure to introduce David Stengel from Board Plus Plus, who's going to be talking to us about building your board. And David and I actually hail from the same town. So we are joining from probably 10 blocks away from each other at the moment. But David, with that, I will let you take it away.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sarah.
And just as a reminder to folks, feel free to put questions in the chat, or if it's easier to just raise your hand, I'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask directly.
Yeah, so the more interactive and conversational this is, the better for me. And Sarah, if you can monitor chat, I will be trying to manage the flow of the conversation. Just jump in. Uh, so I'm David Stengel, and my day job is running a company I founded called Board Plus Plus that diversifies startup boards. Startup boards are incredibly less diverse than public company boards, and I think there's an opportunity to get better startup performance and better leadership development and a better world if the boards were more diverse. So this is really aimed at thinking about startup boards and the kinds of things that a venture capitalist does around boards. So I present this material to founders, to prospective board members, and to investors. And and a lot of the messaging is the same, but it's really aimed at what should you be thinking about as a VC. And I will take some positions that are not in the mainstream, and I'll try to call out when I'm going against conventional wisdom. My deal is I started as a self-taught programmer, uh, found my way to the startup world early, and have been in venture-backed startups for decades. Uh, I also do now, in my old age, a number of mentorship programs, mostly aimed at startups, but not exclusively. And I run a local startup event uh, organization called Startup Grind, and I run the founded and run the Princeton chapter, and I do one or two startup events every month. And I'm happy to talk about uh, board diversity or startup diversity with anybody, anytime, and you can find me on social media or through this deck. Uh, Please ask questions, challenge stuff. I, we all stare at enough PowerPoints on Zoom to get that part of our needs met and come out with what's on your mind. Uh, so, what, in terms of learning objectives, talk a little bit about boards, both board of directors and board of advisors. Uh, I will probably, where I get into more crunchy legal detail, I'll be speaking about US law, and similar things apply in different jurisdictions on the board of directors, but it's not identical. Uh, Talk a little bit about how you can be a good board member and what I would wish for in a board member, how you can recruit strong board members, how you can manage the board as an investor, and how you can help your founders do the same. And this is really focused on board formation and governance before an exit event. There are a set of things once you're filing for an S1 or whatever IPO trajectory, or you're deep into an acquisition by a big player, the kinds of people that you look for in your board to add are all people that are going to facilitate that deal. And that's not really what I'm going to talk about. Questions on any of that? So, startups typically in the US are C corporations, for profit businesses. They are legally obligated to have a board of directors. Typically, an early stage startup will have 3 or 5 board members, and it's good to have an odd number of board members so that you can break ties on votes. Not that that comes up very often. Uh, Usually, in an early stage startup, the founder and the lead investor get a board seat. And uh, there's a space for an independent board member. Uh, Often that space is left open. Um, and if it's not left open, it's typically filled from within the network of the lead investor. Uh, and the thing that's important to understand in a board of directors is that until the founder loses control of the company, until they have less than 50% of the voting shares, uh, it's all sort of advising the founder and its influence without uh, too much authority. And then that flips as the company takes in more investment and the founders and the common shares become the minority, then the board can fire you. So there's this complicated dance where usually the gloves don't come off, but there is this underlying power dynamic that's important to appreciate. Advisory boards, on the other hand, are all over the place. They're powerful tools for addressing needs in the business, but unlike boards of directors, they're usually an individual contributor pairwise meeting with the founder rather than a team sport. And it can be anything from having uh, LeBron James do an endorsement and take 15 minutes of his time for a piece of the company to somebody that's working every day. So it's much wider in the set of responsibilities. As an investor, typically you're saturated at 7 or 8 portfolio companies, and it depends on the body of work that you do. But taking more than that makes it really hard to look at new deals. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And in an advisory board relationship, the board advisor has no power at all. There's no voting rights. They're in essence at will employees. When you think about what makes a good board member, uh, there's a lot of attributes that you want, and the the central dynamic to think about uh, as you look at taking board seats and as you look at interacting with boards is that these are busy, capable people who are being asked to take on uh, important, essential to the life of the company kinds of questions in a compressed time frame with a limited amount of information from the company. And so trust is super important. Uh, Spending time on essential questions is super important. Uh, and there's lots of things that feed into that, but mostly they need to have good chemistry, be able to ask tough questions, expand your thinking, expand your network. And this is what you should do and this is what you should look for your fellow board members to do. So chemistry matters. I would say uh, chemistry is probably it's essential for all kinds of board members, but it's probably the places where I've seen the worst chemistry all come from the investor side, because if you really like the company, you invest, and you might not like the founder, or you might uh, you can get challenging people there. And when you're a startup, sometimes you take the best term sheet, even if you don't love the chemistry with the board member. Uh, but all of these things are true. When you're earlier in your career, maybe you'll have less experience, but you can always be curious. You can always ask tough questions. You can always be thinking about, hey, I saw these things in the sector, and you can give uh, tough feedback, and keep it real. Uh, the most important things are chemistry, having a working relationship with the founder, uh, and that speaks both to trust and competency, and then some conviction for the business. So if you've invested in a startup, they've been through your due diligence process. They've been through, presumably, if you have the board seat, you led the round. You've got conviction for the business when you start, but four pivots later, maybe you don't. And just thinking about how all that goes. Boards have serious legal obligations. So uh, in the U.S., you can, for example, be liable for missed payroll personally if you're a board member. As an institutional investor, your organization should have uh, insurance and protections and agreements that keep you out of trouble there. And the I'm not a lawyer, and none of this is whatever weasel words you should say. But um, if you're doing a good job in studying the information that's provided, you're not going to get hung out to dry for making a bad decision, uh, generally. But you do have very, very serious obligations, and you should show up for board meetings, and we'll talk more about that. But read the minutes, take those responsibilities seriously, and understand you should, as a investor, understand the liabilities that come with taking a board seat. There are institutions that design their participation so that even if they lead around, they refuse board seats and they just take observer seats. And they do that because structurally they don't want to have any formal influence in the decision. Intel does this. Many state funds do this. Uh, but in practice, you act just like a voting board member most of the time. A super early startup like Board Plus Plus, I'm the board. But in a venture situation, usually the board starts with three seats. Again, uh, often the independent board seat is open, and it's not unusual that when you get a new lead for a later round, that new lead takes a board seat and the board grows. And so often they'll match the appointment of the second investor with a second board member representing common shares, and then still keep an independent seat open. But typically, through A, B, maybe C round, you're looking at a 3 or 5 person board. Uh, with public companies, the numbers can get silly, um, over 30, and there's subcommittees and a lot of formality that doesn't touch the startup board scene. Uh, and as I said, it's founders, investors, and independents. So if you're the investor, it's usually your deal, or maybe you're shadowing an MD if you're earlier in your career and apprenticing to them in whatever language they use. But you're representing the investors and preferred stock, and then there's an independent that you, as an investor, typically have an enormous amount of influence in selecting. Any questions on that sort of structural hygiene stuff?
Can you talk about, David, the kind of time that it might take to fill that independent board seat?
Yeah, so I think part of the reason that they stay open is if it takes a long time, it doesn't get filled. So what happens in practice is, let's say you found a company, I invest, you take a board seat, I take a board seat. Then I think, who do I know in my network? And it's like, oh, this is a company that does AI natural learning of corporate communication to scan for bias in language and flag it for uh, correction to improve culture at the company, right? So I want to get somebody that knows the machine learning space and knows natural language processing and knows something about bias and data sets and or whatever, right? Arbitrary example. Uh, so I'll think, do I know somebody in my network? And if I do, I'll fill it. And if I don't, maybe I'll ask the founder, do you know somebody in your network? And if we don't come up with somebody obvious, we won't do a search usually. We'll just leave it open and come back to it later when we do another round. That's so something like 50% of the independent seats sit open in early stages. Uh, but and the other thing, we'll talk about this in recruiting board members, is there are ways to court somebody that you think would be awesome. So like maybe there's some machine learning, text processing Jedi at a university, and they're like, I don't want to be on your board. And you're like, well, be on our board of advisors and do this. And you'll see how shiny we are. And then after you fall in love with the company, then we'll ask you again. Right. So there's that kind of courtship. But usually it gets filled pretty quickly, if it gets filled or it sits open for a long time. Early stage startups don't have the budget to pay anyone to do a board search. So if it's not filled from the network, it just doesn't happen. Does that answer the question?
Yep.
Uh, so when you're on a board, uh, a really good board doesn't spend much time on status updates and runs on time, respects people's time. People come in, I'll go into this in more detail, but you should have a clear understanding of who's leading the board. And often this is in the CEO, but it can be a lead investor. And this isn't someone that's making the decisions. This is someone that's making sure that the meetings run smoothly and crisply, and that you're not jerking people around on time or disorganized mess, right? And they also make sure that the the conversation centers on what's really important and worth discussing, and not just hey, uh, here's all the stuff we did. Yeah, great job, right? So if you're not talking about things that are urgent and important and unclear, then um, you don't really need a board meeting. Uh, so here's another way to think about it. You really want to be paying attention to be honest about what's happening. It's super important as a startup to uh, recognize when the plan you have is failing and what to do about it, and use judgment around what's broken, what needs more time, uh, who's not working out, and those are all things that go much better when there's an environment of trust and integrity and getting to be. I will tell you that my experience is the more matter of fact you are about whatever horrible thing is going on, the better investors like it. Uh, and if you set up an environment where spin is not rewarded, you will get more efficient, productive board meetings. And then emotional quotient, like just be able to read the room. These are all uh, highly capable people, many of whom have big egos, and uh, having more light and less heat is good. So, in general, and this is thinking about both how you contribute and when you recruit third party independent board members, what you can look for. The three buckets are getting somebody with deep expertise in the area that the company needs, getting somebody who is an advocate for the company and can help open doors and bring people in and spread the good word on what the company does, and then people that just cut through the smoke and say this is the essence of what our challenges are, and think about where you would be if you had to pick one of those, and one of those annoying, self-assessment, which one am I, right? Where would you place yourself? uh okay. And then, just because board diversity is my business, I'm gonna uh so most venture boards have no women, um and they're pretty pale, male, and stale, right? And if you want uh a diverse board, you need to actively look for ways to bring in that person. And the point of leverage, and where by far the majority of the diversity that exists in venture boards, is in the independent seats. But that's where you can fill from outside your network and mix it up. So this is not. Uh, I think it's a good practice, but it's certainly not the state of play. And I talked about this earlier, but investors sometimes by structurally take observer roles, and that can be because institutionally they always do that, or it can be because they want a seat at the table, but there isn't room for a voting member, uh, and you should just treat them exactly like anybody else, unless you're having an investor disagreement, and then it's just like any other investor disagreement. Questions on structure, role, any of that? Okay.
You may get to this later on, but how do you think about removing somebody from the board? And when does that
Yeah,
happen?
that's a good thing. So let me come back to that, and please remind me if I don't, after I talk about uh the board meetings themselves and sort of what the dynamics are and what you should train your founders to do for you in a board meeting. And then the corollary to that is, when it all goes off the rails, how do you remove a bad actor? So uh a lot of the board stuff is You're meeting people for a short period of time, um, and you need to be able to trust that the conversations you're having are the real agendas. And so you want to think about how you make uh, emotional deposits in the beginning when it's easy. Uh, and then there's how do you deal with all this stuff? One of my favorite lines about startups in general and board meetings in particular is the first meeting after you invest in a company. First board meeting is the oh by the way meeting, and that is when the startup tells you all the shit that would have made you less excited about investing, right? That they didn't have to tell you, and they wouldn't have lied about it, but it's like, oh, you didn't pick up that rock. Good, good, yeah. Yeah. So some money wired. Yeah. By the way, you should know that. So you want to think about having a relationship with all the people on the board, and depending on the structure of the company, not just the founder, but key personnel within the organization, and depending on the size, that might be the chief revenue officer, or the chief technology officer, or certainly the chief financial officer. But you want to have relationships with them, and those relationships are uh, aimed at trust and having frank and appropriate conversations. You want to be sensitive to level skips. You want to be sensitive to how much weight a casual remark can carry as a board member. So be really speak very softly. Uh, and when you go to a board meeting, you should never have a surprise. So if you go to a board meeting and there's some surprise about revenue or hiring or a key contract or a technology or a patent or whatever, um, this represents a horrific failing by the CEO, and you should uh, uh, really make it clear that it's not acceptable, right? So I'll go into that in a little more detail. So you want to make sure that people are coming to the board meeting prepared. Often this is the board leader's job, but and usually it's the founder's job, right? I would expect the founder to do this in normal situation. But you as the lead investor, or you as an investor board member, you should see that this is happening. And if it's not happening, you should intervene to change the structure of the communication so that it does happen. Because if it doesn't happen, you're not going to get anything useful out of your board. And then you're having really expensive meetings that are wasting people's times, which nobody wants. Uh, and it'll get more formal as the company gets more formal, right? When it's two founders working in the same house from a plan on a napkin, you can just go over and have coffee. And when it's 200 employees, they should be scheduled a year out, and there's structure. Uh, and that's a natural part of the evolution of what happens. There's still the same content buckets that are going to be addressed, but the formality and the way that people parade into the board meetings will change over time. So you should expect regular communication outside of the board meeting. You should figure out how often you're going to talk to your founder, and that will depend on the founder. But only at board meetings is not the right answer, and every day for an hour is not the right answer. So, like, figure out the equilibrium point, uh, and that may flex up and down. Maybe they're doing a strategic partnership with the company that you spent 10 years in their corp dev group, and then you should spend a lot of time on that. Um, or maybe they don't need much for 30, 60 days, but you should be keeping your finger on the pulse in some way. And you should have a good idea of what the pipeline and runway and cap table are of every company that you're on the board of, like almost in your sleep, right? Um, Ways that you can get to this, and this is usually this happens informally. I haven't ever experienced somebody that went through with like, here's my clipboard and my checklist, but you want to get a feel for, are people happier meeting for coffee? Do they want a phone call? Do they want a text? I am, for example, openly mocked by younger generations of my family for not really paying attention to texts. And I'm like, if you want to get me, that's not the way to get me. And but like, you should, that's part of effective communication, right? Is you figure out the channels that work, and you figure out how that information's going to flow. And as a board member, you want to make sure that you're getting the information you need, and that the other board members are getting the information they need. And there's a bunch of stuff around that, like we're starting to meet in person again. And it used to be pre-quarantine that often boards would meet in person, and there'd be a board dinner the night before. And but there's all different ways to do that, and it's not like there's a the right way. There's just a right way that works for the personalities involved. But this goes back to emotional intelligence. Like, make sure that you're establishing rapport with the founder, you're establishing rapport with your fellow board members, that the conversations that you have uh, aren't just nodding and saying, yeah, good job, we'll see you in 3 months, but that you're asking questions that stretch the thinking of the founder and the team. Uh, so, a little bit of how you should lay down the law, in my view, anyway, is you should have a legitimate board package 48 hours in advance, and train your founders to do this. Uh, there are plenty of highly capable introverts in the venture space that will do much better if they look at materials in advance. And there are plenty of super ADD founders that, if you haven't trained them to submit 48 hours in advance, they won't. Right. So just be clear. And there's a little bit of hygiene on that, but like, don't don't put up with people being late. Don't put up with uh I couldn't figure out how to make Zoom work because no one's used Zoom ever. Like, just don't put up with that shit. Uh and that's housekeeping. This is all mechanics now, not substance. But these things matter. It should be a big deal for your startups to do a board meeting properly, but it should not be a performance event where they have to go get a haircut and get their nails done. Be mad if you're surprised. Just like, what were you thinking? Uh, Mark Suster, who I think is really insightful and articulate on this space, but a board meeting is a little bit of update and not a lot. It's a lot of a good one, a lot of talking about, these are the important questions that we're wrestling with. These are the things we're looking for help on. And you shouldn't be shocked. So you're usually ratifying decisions, right? Hey, we're going to pivot our pricing model because we found out these things. Our competitor just made a move 30 days ago, and this is our competitive response. And this is why it's the right response. And if that's controversial, the founder should have canvassed all the board members ahead of time, that kind of stuff. Uh, okay. So you should, this is, whatever venture firm you're in should have some kind of rubric of, this is what they expect in a package. But you should always have the financials, you should always have the burn, you should always have the runway. They ideally have some some idea of what they're measuring for business progress. There's a revenue pipeline or product pipeline, and then hires, right? So you'll often be called upon to give employee grants, option grants, allocate the employee pool. Sometimes you'll be asked to increase the pool. There'll be discussions about when you're doing the next raise and what you're expecting. And this is sort of the bread and butter of a board meeting. And it's important to understand the key hires, understand how you can influence the key hires, understand the burn, and be sensitive to things that are changing burn projections, because that's usually highly significant. And then know where your cap table is, know what's expected on the next raise. So okay, so that's structure. Let me just stop there and then talk a little bit about flow of the meeting and behavior and what you can expect there. Yeah. So typically, uh, different companies have different approaches to how they manage what they present to a board and how cranked up they get about uh, a board meeting. And I find it's a red flag if it's too much of a performance event. You know, if they had the marketing department work for 3 days on the intro video, like that's just wrong. Um, but you, some examples that I would talk about and things that you might see. Uh, I often, as a founder, would use the beginning update part of the board meeting to bring in more junior people in my organization to meet the board member, because it's a really exciting professional opportunity for them. You, as a venture investor, are on Mount Olympus from the perspective of a typical startup employee, and for a chance for them to see you and uh, talk to you and show what they're doing in their department is a really great thing. So some founders, as a matter of course, bring in a cameo every time to help develop their staff. I think it's a good practice, but you can decide how much you like that. Uh, I saw a talk from the founder of Blue Jeans, which is a video messaging corporate platform that had a nine figure exit. Uh, and he ran his uh, open parts of his board meetings, the initial presentations, uh, open to his entire company. And he did it because he felt like there was a rift between sales and customer service on what they were saying about why they were winning or losing accounts. And he was like, you know what? We're just going to be completely transparent within the company. And everything that sales or customer service says to the board, you can watch. And that's like pretty extreme. Um, but it really helped them get sales and customer care on the same page, or together on what truth was. But typically, there's an open session that has more employees. Then there's a core session with the management team, uh, and then there's a session maybe with just the founder, and then you kick the founder out, and the board, the institutional people talk about what they're doing. So that's the flow. Talked about showcase. These are the sessions, uh, and so I'm big on being punctual, right? Like you, you will, if you're dealing with important people and you respect their time, they will notice and appreciate it. So I'll just leave it at that. What's it mean to be a good board member? If you have a board meeting where there's no difference of opinion, then you've added zero value as a board member in terms of the meeting, right? So it's really important to challenge assumptions, to approach things from different angles, to uh, um, come in with the mentality that you're not going to smile and nod, even if the company's doing great, right? It's like, think about what could derail this train. What what are we missing? What is the competition doing? I saw this thing last week that I think is an alternative to what we're offering in market. But like, figure out how to ask those tough questions. And again, you can tee them up before a board meeting, but you want to be able to uh, do something more than smile and nod. So just think about it I encourage you to think about it in that way. If you show up and agree with everything that happens in a board meeting, then you aren't delivering value in that context. There are things you can do outside the meeting. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it's good if you can drive value in the meeting too. Um, and then this is more advice for founders, but it's true of anyone in the board meeting. It is the more when I prepare for board meetings as a founder, I try to be really specific in what I'm looking for help on. So if I go to the board and say, "Hey, I'd like help with revenue," everybody will say sure, and nothing will happen. If I say, "I'm really looking to get somebody that's running a major clinical trial in the oncology area, BMS, that is at this stage," I'll get a very different kind of response, right? So uh, look for those, encourage those kinds of asks, and be sensitive to when you're just having a conversation about philosophy that's not going to go anywhere. Uh, okay, so this is the structure. Talked about that. Um, and if you're working with an experienced founder, they will be completely familiar with this. If you're working with a first-time founder, as an investor, it's your job to educate them on board hygiene, right? So if you have first-time founders, they don't know how any of this works, and as the institutional investor, it's your job to help them understand the rules of the road in the venture community. And that means you should know 'em. You're the subject matter expert on venture. And here's what you expect in a board package. Here's what you're going to do. Then you're going to kick him out of the room and huddle about, is there anything? And this typically happens when you have a 5-person board where there's multiple investors. Uh, but just be very matter of fact about it. There's things that you want to talk about with the founder not there, and they should expect that and not uh, have some kind of panic attack. Uh, okay, um, you should get good minutes from a board, right? So this is like a really mundane task. It's the secretary does it. Uh, every time uh, there's a legal action involving the board, which doesn't happen all that often, but the minutes are what's used for the court case. So just expect that you're going to be deposed by a hostile attorney on those minutes. So they better be right. Um, and it's a way for you to sort of look at, this is what happened that mattered in the board meeting, and this is what we're going to prep for next time. But do plan to, in your cadence of communication with the founder and the rest of the company and your colleagues on the board, including sort of the extended support network of outside counsel and whoever else is sitting in, um, do actually read the minutes. So when you're on board, most of the time, if things are going well, all of the time, you're working for the founder. So you have some slice of time where you're providing things that are helpful to them. And the guidance for being a good board member is keep your nose in and your hands off. So if you're telling them what to do, almost certainly wrong. If you're uh, doing operational stuff, almost certainly wrong. But if you're saying, "Hey, how are you spending your time, founder? How much are you doing on revenue? How much are you doing on hiring? How much are you like what's dragging you down? Um, Also, uh, the easiest thing that you get out of board members is any board member, and the later you are in your career, the more true this will be, should have a big set of contacts that can help, right? So the right introduction can be really powerful. But even at the beginning of your career, like read the room, bring your emotional intelligence, think about how to get them uh, thinking about the right stuff and how to clear obstacles out of their way. As a board, you you're helping the CEO and you're doing that in ways that are efficient of your time, and you're not signing up for big projects that you can't do. But uh, even when you have control as the investors, you're still doing that. You're not, in general, going to tell a CEO to do something different than what they planned. If they routinely do things that you think they shouldn't be doing, you don't retrain them, you fire them. And there's a whole set of conversations about, once the board has control, you can decide the CEO is no longer a good fit. Boom, we're going to blow them out. Those are conversations that happen without the CEO at a certain point. Um, but until you fire them, you're there to help them. And you should approach them with the, how do I make your life easier? How do I make you more productive? How do I help you navigate into the wider resources of my investor firm, the wider resources of my network, uh, to achieve your goals? Uh, okay, so now let's talk about, so questions on that. That was, and I'll get to board changes, which includes, I guess, blowing out undesirables. Okay, so the most common way that a board changes is more money comes in and somebody, the new lead, wants a seat. Uh, but it can also be you blow out a board member, you replace the CEO or another member of the founding team that has a board seat. You reject your independent board member, and let me take those scenarios sort of one by one. So, founder, we talked about a little bit. You can't really fire the founder until you have control as the investors. And when the investors have majority and they agree that the founder should go, uh, usually they've lined up a replacement. Boom, and those conversations will happen between the investors outside of the boardroom, right? Uh, if you fire a lead investor, uh, pretty rare, right? You can be unhappy with an investor, and usually they have. Sarah, you probably know more about this than I do, but you have protections that say I get to keep my seat, and you can't, throw me out of the room. But there are situations where, because of the maturity of the fund or the health of the fund or the personality of the investor, maybe the company's pivoted and one of the investors doesn't agree with the new direction, and they're a grumpy minority that sits in the board meeting with their arms crossed. Uh, and if you can get them out of the room, that's fine. And if you can't, uh, you still need to work with them. And working with jerks is part of the deal, or people that just disagree fundamentally with the direction you're taking the company. Um, but usually, in, you can get rid of someone that doesn't agree with the direction of the company with an up round. There's a whole different set of dynamics that come into play when you have two investors that have fundamentally different objectives, or two shareholders, right? So uh, if I'm a small first time fund and you're my last company that might be profitable and I desperately need you to have a big exit, in the next year, or my fund goes under. And Sarah is on Fund 10 and awash in lift from all her successful investments, and is looking at the big picture and the life of the company. We're going to have really different treatments of what we want the company to do, uh, by the imperatives of our funds. And you need to be aware of that, even if it results in sort of an ugly conversation and conflict of interest. But be sensitive to that bigger picture, that if we're both in the same stage in our portfolio, and we both have dry powder, and we both have a common conviction about the business and how long it will take to mature, and the state of the market, and how frothy it is, and when we should exit, if we're in agreement on all these things, it's beautiful, compared to, I think the market's going to crash next year and values are overblown and we should get out now and have a liquidity event. And you know, uh, so understand that, and talk to other your colleagues in your fund and in your industry to get a sense of where that is, because you will hear stories about where those things are different, and lots of good learning can come from those stories, even if it's painful good learning. Is that fair, Sarah?
Yes, and very truthful.
So, think about that, but understand what you're representing as the investor. Understand to your core why you need 10x returns. And if you haven't like gone through one of their many uh, thoughtful explanations of why a venture investor needs 10x returns, and that's a little reductionist. But generally, just doing the venture math of understanding uh, the median startup fails. What does that mean? How does that reflect the emotional truth of how you engage with your portfolio companies? You have to realize that as you're working with these founders, you're doing everything you can to make them successful, and their mortality rate is really high. And so part of what you want to do is work with great people. And even if they have a company that doesn't work out, if you've done right by them and they've done right by you, that is a resource for both of you that will help you in the next rung in your career. And it's super important to invest in that. And that's your personal brand, that's your personal network, that transcends the success of any particular portfolio company, because you will have plenty of deaths. um, okay. uh, so other things to think about in board seat changes. Sometimes you get situations where uh, you have a lame duck board member, and it can be. So I'll give a couple examples from uh, recent experience, last few years. You can have somebody that's got cancer, right? And it's like they're winding down all the things that they do, and maybe they're not stepping down from the board yet, but you can see the writing on the wall. You can have somebody that is in the current fund at their firm, but is not going to be in the next fund because this is their last time and they're going to retire in the next 18 months. And so they're going to be replaced. And then the new person that comes in, it wasn't a deal that they sponsored or they had conviction on. So there are things like that that you can be sensitive to. Uh, but as an investor, you're not going to have much influence, if any, on who the other investors appoint as their board member, right? If my fund is investing with Sarah's fund, I'm not going to go tell Sarah who she should put on her board seat. Um, and if I did, it would probably not be received well. Or she told me that it would not be received well. I can say that with more confidence. So, and on the founder side, it kind of is what it is. Uh, maybe you bring in like a new dynamic president, and they want to see. Uh, those are the kinds of situations where you can bring in somebody new. As a board member, make sure that new board members, whatever their circumstances are, have a good onboarding experience. I like to say that the worst onboarding is experienced by interns and board members, right? So there's this Laffer curve where in the middle there's a process, and at the ends it's kind of, yeah, meetings next week, see ya. Uh, okay, next area. Um, if you're recruiting as a board member, one of the things you can do that adds value is to bring in a strong independent board member. And when you do that, uh, usually they're doing it because the startup's interesting and not because, so they're not coming in as an investor. This is talking about the independent board seat. Um, and they're going to do it because the startup's shiny in some way, or they like working with you, or they like working with the founder. But think about what kind of talent will help the company, and you should have conviction about your startup. You should be able to say all these things if you're on a board. Um, but but think about what you do, and then it's going to go back to the list I showed earlier of these are the kinds of qualities you want in board meeting, and you can think about the gaps in the skill sets of the players that are already on the board when you're filling that independency. And that can be gaps in network, gaps in understanding, specific domain expertise. It can be a lot of things. And but it's fun to be on a board if you're on the right board. Um,
David, I know
expect.
we're coming up
Oh, okay.
on time here, and at the risk of not wanting everybody to get zoomed out,
Yeah.
um, any kind of highlights from, and I'm going to share the rest of the deck with everybody, and so
Okay.
any kind of highlights that you would give, or closing thoughts on, like, here's what things that I've seen, or um, any advice for the
Yeah.
intern.
So the most important things are um, establishing trust and the ability to have uh, frank conversations about difficult topics. And as if you're going to be an investor, you're going to deal with um, companies dying horrible deaths all the time, and you need to be able to look people in the eye and talk about the hard stuff. And the way that you do that is you build trust every day, and that's a personal thing. Don't aim for consensus. Challenge your founders, challenge your other board members, uh, and don't get sucked into operations. The fact that you can do it better than whoever you're talking to is worth nothing. And if you start doing it, you've infantilized them and wasted your own time. So uh, that's really and train your founders to give you what you need and what they should do early. Uh, the other thing I'd say, and this is my maybe not all of you will choose to be a VC after you go through this program. If you have ambitions as not just a venture investor, but as someone that wants to rise to leadership in any capacity, uh, developing board skills will make you a stronger leader. It will make you think about tough decisions and managing tough decisions in groups. It will help you think about distilling what's important. It will help you make life and death from an entity perspective questions and answer them quickly and decisively. And those are all really powerful skills. So I encourage all of you, as a self selected group of aspiring VCs, to think about uh, how taking board seats earlier in your career can help you, because I think it will help you. All right, that's it.
Wonderful.
You can find me on social media. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff, and I hope this was helpful.
Great. Thank you, David. This is such an enormous topic, and one that doesn't really get discussed at many other VC career acceleration programs, because it's not the sexy stuff. And so but it's absolutely essential to the way that we operate. And actually, once you get into the kind of later stages of being a VC, this is where you spend most of your time. And so being able to navigate a board and being able to navigate the personalities of a board are really, really important. So David, thank you so much for joining us today. As usual, I will have these slides and the recording of this up on the Notion. And tomorrow we have SaaS investing with Jennifer Richard from Bonfire, who's a personal friend of mine. So I know it's been a busy week, but I will see most of you at the meeting tomorrow. Have a great rest of your night. Take care, everybody.
Take care.